Well, actually, this is a little intimidating. I don't have the authority, the dress, which you guys really look good in.
We sure.
Pardon?
That's why I won the tie.
That's right. And no tie for me, you know. I'll tell you, it's disgusting. If my wife would have watched me in dress, she said, no tie, no tie. At any rate, I'd like to give you a little background, and maybe not quite as doctrinally anchored, but anchored in humanity, which was something that God created us all to be. I will refer sometimes to the Old Testament. I don't like calling it the Old Testament, it's the Tanakh. That's how we refer to it, because for some reason or other, when you say old around people, it makes things are irrelevant. And I just don't believe that at all. St. Augustine was probably one of the first quoted to say the old is the new concealed. The new is the old revealed.
Amen.
And I cannot stress that anymore than I could, even with a hammer. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was in a Reformed Jewish congregation. My father was from a somewhat Orthodox family. His parents were immigrants from Ukraine. And they didn't say Shabbat. Shabbat is a rather new thing. Shabbat is an Israeli thing. They were from Eastern Europe and they said Shabbos. And you probably heard Good Shabbos before, because they pronounced the T as an S. And I have a friend of mine who is a wonderful rabbinic scholar that guarantees me that that's really the way Hebrew should be. But he's also from Eastern Europe as well. At any rate, it was a very important part of our lives. It was part of your family. It was Friday night, and even in the summertime, we would go see my grandmother. My grandfather died 5 years before I was born. And but Grandma was still the matriarch of the family. And all the 4 children and their children came to see Grandma on Friday evening, and she did the cooking. No matter how old she was, she insisted on doing the cooking. And the food, by the way, was absolutely wonderful. Okay? And the time was wonderful, and we enjoyed the family. I can even remember in the summer, we go outside and we get all hot and sweaty and dirty, and my mother would make us go in, change, have baths, and then change in pajamas to go to Grandma's on Friday night. Because after all, that's where we had to be. And that was the Sabbath for me. And then I was receiving my training in a religious school at Temple Shalom, and we went to Hebrew on Fridays, and then I went to a Shabbat school on Saturday morning, 9 to 12, and then later on Sunday, because they gave us 2 different days to go. And after all the good cartoons were on Saturday, so I went on Sunday. But we did not really believe or have the legalistic approach to the scriptures. I had friends of mine who were Orthodox. One friend of mine that lived on my street had the same name as me. His name was Aaron Kindelier, and his parents were Holocaust survivors. And I had to grimace as I saw the marks on their arms. And they were of the Orthodox tradition. And Friday was a very, very sacred day. On the other hand, though, I also, as I grew older, found out that it was a rather limiting day. And as I've learned as a believer, we don't make the day holy. God does that. Just like He made it be holy, and continues to try to do so. We can keep it holy. And I would watch them as they would go through all of their different traditions on Friday evening. And I thought, why don't we do that? But yet, I didn't want to feel that constrained, because there were so many things he wasn't allowed to do on Saturday that we were. And I can remember my father arguing, because we had a Lubavitcher rabbi in Cincinnati. Cincinnati had a much larger Jewish population than Louisville, like 40,000 Jews, not Chicago or Cleveland. But anyway, there was a Rabbi Silver whom most of the Reformed people didn't care for, because he told the Jewish Community Center when it was to open and when it was to close. And there was a lot of legalistic things. I had a friend of mine whose father was a conservative rabbi, lived in a beautiful home in Amberley Village in Cincinnati, but I found out later that they had electrical instrumentation that would turn the lights on and off for them in the weekends, because after all, you're not supposed to turn a light on, because that's kindling a fire. I don't think that even with LED now, you're definitely not kindling a fire. But the is, that's what they would do. They would walk to shul. They would have to walk to shul because, after all, when you start a car, you are kindling a fire. The legalism was unbelievable. And as I became a believer at the age 22 and opened up Romans, because that's the first thing I ever read. Somebody gave me a copy of the paraphrased epistles by J.D. Phillips. And I got to Romans chapter 2, and it says, the true Jew is not one outwardly, but inwardly. And that's what I wanted to be. As I was trying to accommodate certain things, because now as a believer, most of my Jewish friends would say, you're no longer Jewish, and yet I knew I was still Jewish. As a matter of fact, I had really become Jewish because I knew Him. I knew God. I just didn't know the name. I knew Him personally. That's what we're all for. And in the same sense, as I think about the Sabbath, I think about the days that He has given me and the rest that He has given me. Now, I go to worship on Saturdays because of the Messianic congregation. That's what we want to do. But I've worshiped on Sundays, too, for 27 years in a Christian church. Because, after all, they're my brothers in the Lord as well. And all the Christian means is follower of the Messiah, which is exactly what I am. So I don't want to get tied up in when I think about the law and I think about the Sabbath. I'm grateful for it. I believe that God gave it to us as a gift. He's the one that makes it holy. We can keep it holy, but He makes it holy. We keep it holy by learning how to really have that relationship with Him. And quite frankly, every day of my life is a special day with Him. And it gets up and starts with Him, and it ends with Him in the evening. And sometimes He has to smack me around to remind me. But the point is, it's still there, and He's still there. And He's not going to let me go. And that's where I rejoice in the gift of the Sabbath. I can also be real technical and medical and say that, hey, I'm a lot better off if I take one day off a week instead of working 7 days. God knew exactly what He was doing. The Sabbath was not a taskmaster, never intended to be that way. It was a gift from a very holy God. And I'm very grateful for that.
Amen.